Did we ever really know who the Sioux were? Or did we just mistake one dramatic chapter for the whole story? What if the DNA did not destroy their history, but exposed how small our version of that history always was? Before we go deeper, do this with me. If you love videos that challenge old myths without killing the mystery, tap like, subscribe, and share this with one friend who loves history that refuses to stay simple. Most people think they already know the answer. Say the word Sioux, and the same picture appears almost instantly. Riders on the open plains, buffalo hunts under a huge sky, warriors facing the U.S. Army, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, resistance, pride, tragedy. It is one of the most powerful images in American history. And to be clear, that image is real. It matters. It belongs in the story, but it is not the full story, not even close. Because once scientists began looking carefully at old DNA, and once historians placed that science beside oral tradition, language, archaeology, and migration, a very different picture started to come. Because once scientists began looking carefully at old DNA, and once historians placed that science beside oral tradition, language, archaeology, and migration, a very different picture started to come into focus. Not a fake picture, not a replacement, a deeper one, a stranger one, a more human one. The truth was not that the Sioux were somehow less native, as careless people on the internet love to suggest. The truth was almost the opposite. Their roots turned out to be older, wider, and more layered than the simple textbook image most of us inherited. And that is why this story matters. Because this is not really a story about catching history in a lie. It is a story about what happens when we confuse identity with stereotype, when we freeze a people in one famous moment, and when science forces us to admit that the past was never as neat as we wanted it to be. A good place to begin is with one of the most famous names in Native history, Sitting Bull. In 2021, researchers working with a small lock of Sitting Bull's hair used a new genetic method to test whether Ernie LaPointe was truly his direct living descendant. That question had carried real emotional weight for years, because LaPointe and his sisters had long maintained the family connection, while others doubted it. The hair itself was difficult to work with. It was old, fragile, and badly degraded. For a long time, it seemed almost impossible to use, but the team succeeded, and the results supported LaPointe's claim. The DNA showed that he was indeed Sitting Bull's great-grandson and closest living descendant. That alone would have been enough to make headlines. It was personal, it was historic, it was moving. A family memory carried across generations had been confirmed by modern science, but that study also pushed people back toward a bigger question. If DNA could recover a living connection to one of the most iconic Lakota leaders in history, what else could genetics reveal about the deeper story behind the peoples often grouped under the name Sioux? And this is where the ground begins to shift. Because for a long time, popular history treated the Sioux as if they had always been exactly what Americans encountered in the 19th century. A plains people, horse people, buffalo people, war leaders of the grasslands. It is the version repeated in films, museums, school lessons, and even some serious writing. Again, it is not invented, it is just incomplete. The deeper scientific story starts far earlier than horses, far earlier than rifles, far earlier than the United States, and even far earlier than the Great Plains identity that later became so famous. To understand the shock, we need one simple idea from genetics. Every population carries lineages that can be traced backward through time. Some of those lineages come through the mother, some through the father, and some through the wider mix of ancestry across the whole genome. None of them tell the whole story alone. But together, they can show patterns of movement so old that no written record exists for them. One of the lineages that drew attention in Native American studies is called haplogroup X, and more specifically, a native branch of it known as X2A. That probably sounds technical, but the basic idea is simple. Think of it like a very old family signal passed down through maternal lines over thousands of years. Scientists found this signal in some indigenous communities in North America, including among some Sioux-related groups and among Ojibwe communities. What made researchers pause was not the presence of X2A itself, it was the wider family it belonged to. Related branches of haplogroup X are found in parts of Western Eurasia and the Near East, but the Native American branch, X2A, appears to be its own distinct branch, and for years people argued over what that meant. That debate quickly got messy. Some people rushed to a dramatic conclusion. They claimed this was proof that Europeans, or people from the Near East, had crossed the Atlantic in ancient times and founded part of Native America. It sounded exciting, it sounded disruptive, it sounded like the kind of theory people repeat because it feels too big to ignore. There was just one problem. The evidence never supported that conclusion. Over time, more detailed genetic work kept pushing against that sensational idea. Reviews of the evidence rejected the claim that X2A proved some lost European colony in ancient America. X2A is not a random Western Eurasian marker dropped into native history like a foreign coin. It is an old Native American branch with its own history inside the Americas. And that is a crucial point. So if the simple Atlantic story fails, why did this lineage matter at all? Because it hinted at something more complicated about the founding populations of the Americas. For many years, the easy version of the story was that the first Americans came from Northeast Asia across Beringia, the ancient land connection between Siberia and Alaska, and then spread through the continents. That broad outline still holds. But DNA made the inner picture much more complex. The ancestors of Native Americans were not a single pure block moving through history untouched. They were already a mixed population before they entered the Americas. That became much harder to deny after the sequencing of the ancient Siberian individual known as MA1, often called the Malta boy, whose remains were around 24,000 years old. His genome showed ties to an ancient population that also contributed ancestry to Native Americans. In plain English, part of Native American ancestry traces back to an old Siberian population that was related not just to East Asians, but also to ancient groups tied more broadly to Western Eurasian ancestry. This did not mean Native Americans came from Europe. It meant the ancient peoples living in Siberia long before. The peopling of the Americas were themselves more mixed and more interesting than older models assumed. That is a very different claim, and it matters. Because once you understand that, the whole mystery changes shape. The question is no longer, how did a strange foreign signal get into the Sioux? The better question is, why were we expecting human ancestry to look clean and simple in the first place? The deeper researchers looked, the more the old fantasy of pure origins started to collapse. Even the famous case of Kennewick Man helped drive that lesson home. His remains created years of speculation. Some observers claimed his features looked unlike those of modern Native Americans. Some tried to use his skeleton as proof of some separate ancient population. But later, genome work showed that he was clearly connected to Native Americans. Once again, DNA cut through a misleading visual assumption. That pattern keeps repeating in human history. We see a face, a skull, a painting, speculation. Some observers claimed his features looked unlike those of modern Native Americans. Some tried to use his skeleton as proof of some separate ancient population. But later genome work showed that he was clearly connected to Native Americans. Once again, DNA cut through a misleading visual assumption. That pattern keeps repeating in human history. We see a face, a skull, a painting, a battlefield scene, and we build a story around it. Then the evidence gets better and the older story suddenly looks too narrow. So what did DNA finally reveal about the Sioux? Not that they were outsiders, not that they were secretly European, not that their identity was false. What it revealed was that the peoples called Sioux were part of a much deeper Native American story, one tied to ancient population mixing in Siberia, long before the first communities spread through North America. The mystery was real, but the answer was not the cheap answer many people wanted. And in some ways, that answer is even more powerful, because it says the roots were not shallow at all. They were ancient, Ice Age ancient. But then the story takes another turn, because even after you understand that deep ancestry, you still have to deal with another surprise. The Sioux were not originally people of the open plains in the way most of us imagine. That image, the one burned into public memory, came late, much later than most people realize. Quick pause before this gets even bigger. If a single idea in this video has already surprised you, hit like now, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and share this with someone who still thinks history moves in straight lines. This is where genetics alone is not enough. You have to bring in oral tradition, language, and archaeology. And when those pieces are placed together, they point toward an eastern and woodland past for the ancestors of the peoples we later recognize as Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, along with other Siouan-speaking groups. Early records and indigenous traditions describe movement from the east. Linguists studying the wider Siouan language family have long connected parts of that family to regions east of the later Plains heartland, including the upper Mississippi and areas tied to the eastern woodlands. Archaeology also supports a long history in the forested and river-rich interior of North America before the great horse culture of the plains fully emerged. That means the most familiar image of the Sioux, though true for a later era, captures them after a major transformation, not before it. And that changes everything about how we picture them. Imagine a people remembered by the world for 150 years of dramatic plains history when their deeper journey had already stretched across thousands. Imagine being reduced to your last costume. Imagine the whole world looking at the final act and calling it the entire play. That is what happened. The ancestors of these communities were not always mounted buffalo hunters racing under endless grassland skies. Earlier, many lived in woodland environments, near rivers and lakes, combining hunting, gathering, trade, and agriculture in ways that looked very different from the famous 19th century plains identity. Their world was shaped by forests, waterways, villages, shifting alliances, and seasonal rhythms that do not fit the movie version most people carry in their heads. Then history moved. Pressure from other native nations, changing trade networks, the spread of firearms through the fur trade, environmental opportunity, and later, the arrival of the horse all helped reshape life across the center of the continent. Conflicts with the Ojibwe intensified in the 18th century. Migrations accelerated, communities moved, adapted, rebuilt, and when the horse transformed mobility on the plains, the result was astonishing. Within a relatively short historical window, parts of the Sioux world became one of the most effective and recognizable plains cultures in North America. Their skill on horseback, their hunting systems, their military power, and their social adaptation to the plains became so striking that later observers treated that identity as timeless. It was not timeless. It was brilliant. There is a difference. That difference matters because timeless suggests something frozen. Brilliant suggests intelligence, flexibility, choice, and survival. The Sioux did not appear on the plains as if they had been designed for a museum display. They became who they needed to become inside a changing world. That is not a weakness in the story. That is the story. And it leads to one of the most important lessons in this entire topic. People often talk about identity as if it must be ancient, fixed, and unmoving to be real. But human groups do not work that way. Nations move, languages split, families merge, trade changes belief, war changes geography, new animals change economics, new tools change power. But people can transform dramatically and still remain fully themselves. In fact, that may be one of the deepest signs of a living culture. The Sioux story proves that identity is not invalid because it has layers. Identity becomes more remarkable because it survives those layers. That is why the Sitting Bull DNA result feels so symbolic, even beyond the family question it answered. On one level, it confirmed a specific relationship. A man living today truly carried a direct genetic connection to one of the most famous anti-colonial leaders in American history. On another level, it exposed something almost poetic. Empires write reports. Schools repeat simplified versions. Popular culture turns people into icons. Yet under all of that, in the body itself, continuity can survive. Quietly, patiently. Across broken promises, land seizures, forced removals, boarding schools, museum collections, and all the machinery built to erase native memory. The continuity does not survive because history was gentle. It survives because people did. And that is where this topic becomes bigger than one tribe, one lineage, or one DNA branch. The real shock is not that the Sioux were never what we thought. The real shock is that almost no people in history are what simplified public memory thinks they are. The farther back you go, the less tidy the map becomes. A nation that looks fixed in the 19th century may have been moving in the 17th. History are what simplified public memory thinks they are. The farther back you go, the less tidy the map becomes. A nation that looks fixed in the 19th century may have been moving in the 17th. A language that looks local may carry traces of a much older homeland. A genetic signature that looks strange in isolation may make perfect sense once you understand events from 15,000 years earlier, and the labels we use so casually can hide all of that. Even the word Sioux itself can blur more than it reveals. It is often used as a blanket label, but the peoples inside that name include distinct communities with their own histories, dialects, and identities, especially Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. When outsiders compress all of that into one image, one costume, one battlefield, include distinct communities with their own histories, dialects, and identities, especially Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. When outsiders compress all of that into one image, one costume, one battlefield, the result is not clarity, it is flattening. That flattening has consequences. Because once the people are flattened, they are easier to romanticize, easier to stereotype, easier to erase, and easier to misunderstand when new evidence appears. Then comes the internet version of history, where someone sees one genetic term and instantly declares that everything they were taught was fake. That reaction is not bold, it is lazy. Real history is harder than that. Real history asks better questions. For example, what exactly does a maternal, not bold, it is lazy. Real history is harder than that. Real history asks better questions. For example, what exactly does a maternal lineage tell us, and what can it not tell us? It can show one line of descent. It can illuminate deep population history. It can reveal movement and relatedness over huge timescales. But it cannot summarize a whole people by itself. The same is true of autosomal DNA. It is powerful because it samples the broader ancestry of a person, but even that has to be interpreted carefully inside archaeology, language, oral tradition, and community knowledge. If you rip genetics out of that larger frame, you do not get truth. You get confusion with scientific vocabulary. That is why the best archaeology, language, oral tradition, and community knowledge. If you rip genetics out of that larger frame, you do not get truth. You get confusion with scientific vocabulary. That is why the best researchers tend to be cautious when the rest of the world wants drama. They know one result rarely ends a story. Usually it deepens it. Take the old debate around haplogroup X2A. People wanted a headline answer. Atlantic Voyagers, Lost Hebrews, Secret Europeans, a giant reversal of native origins. But careful work kept saying the same thing in more patient language. No, that is not what the evidence shows. The branch in Native America is ancient. The founding populations of the Americas were already complex. The answer lies in deeper Siberian and Beringian prehistory, not fantasy invasions. It's the same thing in more patient language. No, that is not what the evidence shows. The branch in Native America is ancient. The founding populations of the Americas were already complex. The answer lies in deeper Siberian and Beringian prehistory, not fantasy invasions designed to steal indigenous antiquity. That last part is important, because many of the strangest theories about native origins are not innocent mistakes. Often beneath the surface, there is an old habit at work, an urge to deny native peoples the full depth of their own past. If a monument is impressive, someone says outsiders must have built it. If a genetic lineage is unusual, someone says it must prove foreigners were there first. If an oral tradition is rich, someone tries to rewrite it from outside. The pattern is ugly and it is old. And this is where the DNA story becomes unexpectedly moral. The science did not shrink the Sioux story. It protected it from bad faith simplification. It showed that, yes, the ancestry is deep. Yes, it is complex. Yes, it reaches into Ice Age Siberia and ancient mixing events long before written history. And yes, the later Plains identity was real, powerful, and historically transformative without being the beginning of the story. Those things can all be true at once. That is what mature history sounds like. Not clean, not comforting, but true enough to hold contradictions without breaking. And once you see that, even familiar scenes start to look different. Picture the Battle of the Little Bighorn again. Now do not see it as the whole identity of the Sioux. See it as one fierce moment at the surface of a far older river. Behind those riders stood generations who knew other landscapes. Behind those landscapes stood older migrations. Behind those migrations stood the ancient peoples of Siberia and Beringia. Behind that stood the long human habit of moving, adapting, joining, splitting, and surviving. That is what was really present on that battlefield too, not just resistance in Siberia and Beringia. Behind that stood the long human habit of moving, adapting, joining, splitting, and surviving. That is what was really present on that battlefield too, not just resistance in the moment, continuity across unimaginable time. And maybe that is why stories like this hit so hard. They remind us that identity is not a costume you put on for the camera of history. It is a chain carried through bodies, places, kinship, language, memory, and change. It survives relocation. It survives pressure. Sometimes, it even survives being misdescribed by the world for generations. Now, here's my deal with you. If this video is changing how you think in real time, subscribe before the algorithm buries it, drop a like. So here is my deal with you. If this video is changing how you think in real time, subscribe before the algorithm buries it. Drop a like so more people find it, and share it with someone who thinks DNA always gives simple answers. It almost never does. And there's one more layer we have to talk about, because the phrase DNA revealed the truth can be helpful, but it can also be misleading if we are not careful. DNA did not walk into a room and announce a final verdict on who the Sioux really are. People are not court cases. What DNA did was force a correction in the public imagination. It challenged two shallow habits at the same time. First, it challenged the idea on who the Sioux really are. People are not court cases. What DNA did was force a correction in the public imagination. It challenged two shallow habits at the same time. First, it challenged the idea that the Sioux were just the Plains image most outsiders remember. Second, it challenged the idea that any genetic surprise must mean native history is less native. Both habits were wrong. The broader truth is richer. The peoples called Sioux were deeply native, deeply rooted in the peopling of the Americas, tied to ancient ancestry that formed before the continents were filled and shaped over time by migration, adaptation, conflict, and creativity. Their famous Plains culture was not a fake mask. It was a historic achievement built on formed before the continents were filled and shaped over time by migration, adaptation, conflict, and creativity. Their famous Plains culture was not a fake mask. It was a historic achievement built on older foundations. That is a much better story than the myth it replaces. And it also asks something of us. It asks us to stop treating Indigenous history as static. That static way of thinking has damaged understanding for a very long time. It produces the strange expectation that native peoples must either remain exactly as outsiders first described them or somehow become less authentic. But no civilization on Earth meets that standard. Not Romans, not Chinese dynasties, not Arabs, not English kingdoms, not anyone. Why should native nations be trapped by it? Why should a people cease as outsiders first described them or somehow become less authentic? But no civilization on Earth meets that standard. Not Romans, not Chinese dynasties, not Arabs, not English kingdoms, not anyone. Why should native nations be trapped by it? Why should a people cease to be themselves because they moved west, adapted to horses, fought new wars, spoke related dialects, or carried ancestry with deep Siberian complexity? They should not. And once that becomes obvious, the title of this video starts to sound different. The Sioux were never what we thought, not because they were less than the legend, because they were more ancient than the Plains stereotype, more diverse than the single label, more dynamic than the frozen image, more connected to the great human story of migration than the old textbook allowed, and more resistant to simplification than more diverse than the single label, more dynamic than the frozen image, more connected to the great human story of migration than the old textbook allowed, and more resistant to simplification than popular history is comfortable admitting. That also helps explain why oral tradition matters so much here. Long before geneticists extracted data from old hair or ancient bones, native communities were already preserving memory in other ways. Not memory in the narrow modern sense of a date and a document, but memory in movement stories, kinship, place, ceremony, naming, and continuity. Science did not create that depth. At its best, science met it. Sometimes it confirmed it. Sometimes it complicated it. But the conversation only becomes kinship, place, ceremony, naming, and continuity. Science did not create that depth. At its best, science met it. Sometimes it confirmed it. Sometimes it complicated it. But the conversation only becomes honest when community history is treated as part of the evidence, not as a decorative extra added after the fact. That is especially important because DNA can answer some questions very well, but it cannot tell people what their culture means. It cannot measure belonging. It cannot replace language. It cannot define a nation's sacred geography, and it cannot speak over living communities about their own identity. So when we say the DNA finally revealed the truth, the smartest version of that sentence is this. DNA revealed that the he's the outsider story was too small. That is the truth. It revealed that the famous Plains warriors were also heirs to older woodland worlds. It revealed that a seemingly strange maternal lineage did not overturn native origins, but pointed toward deeper complexity in the ancient ancestors of Native Americans. It revealed that a family line reaching from Sitting Bull to the present was real. And it revealed that what survives colonization is not only memory in books, but memory in people. That may be the strongest part of the whole story. Because when you strip away the noise, what remains is not a puzzle built for internet arguments. What remains is continuity. A child becomes a parent becomes an ancestor. Communities shift, but they endure. Languages change shape, but they carry old worlds inside them. Nations are pushed, renamed, divided, studied, photographed, and misunderstood, but they are still there, still speaking, still remembering, still connected. And maybe that is why the most serious lesson here is also the simplest. History does not become more truthful when it becomes more shocking. It becomes more truthful when it becomes more complete. The Sioux were never a one-scene people. They were never only writers on the plains. They were never only names in war reports. They were never only a mystery in a DNA chart. They were and are part of a living story that begins deep in the human past, moves through eastern woodlands and river worlds, rises into the plains with extraordinary force, survives conquest, and still refuses to fit inside the categories built around it. So the next time you hear someone say the Sioux were never what we thought, do not hear that as a debunking. Hear it as an invitation. An invitation to leave behind the cardboard version of history. An invitation to respect complexity instead of running from it. An invitation to understand that truth is often larger than myth, not smaller. And an invitation to see that sometimes the most powerful thing DNA can do is not replace human history, but humble the stories we told before we knew enough. If this kind of history is your thing, do not just watch and scroll away. Join this channel, leave a like that tells the platform depth still matters, and share this with someone who is ready for the longer version of the past. Because in the end, the biggest revelation was never that the Sioux story was false. It was that we had been looking at it through a keyhole. The lock opened, and behind that narrow view was something far older, far more layered and far more unforgettable than the legend we thought we knew.